start off, I'll welcome everyone as once our session goes live, provide just the welcoming, some housekeeping rules, and walk through this agenda. Then I'm going to hand it over to Jay to provide some remarks from USAID. I'll handle then the speaker transitions once Jay is done. So then I'll introduce Katie, and Katie will speak. I'll introduce Beck and Amy. And then we'll go through to Bryan. So there is a slide where we can pause after Bryan before we get into the breakouts for just any kind of pressing questions. So then we'll see if there are, because I'm not be able to see the chats, but during that pause, Bryan, if there's one or two questions we want to pull from the chats or the comments, we can address it there before going into the breakout session. I think a lot of this also be driven by time. But once I then will, and I'm talking and indicating we're going to start into the breakout discussions. As I'm talking, if so if Bryan, you could go into group one and by go into through Pathable, just click on going into group one. Beck and Michelle, if you could do that for group two, and Katie and Amy for group three, just because the host has to join and start the group, and then others can join. And
on this main
page. Yeah. So then
I see.
Asking everyone and to put all their chats and everything in the Pathable page. Enter the group back in Path. My name is Marc Detman, and I'm the program director at the Global Environment Technology Foundation, GETF, for the governance research on water systems, or GROWS activity that is funded by USAID Africa Bureau Office of Sustainable Development. We're excited to have you join us today for a presentation and discussion on the cross-sector linkages between rural water governance, rural water and governance. Democracy, human rights, and governance, or DRG, and water are critical components of sustainable development. Based on the GROWS insight that we will get into today, we believe that development projects work better when they address key governance issues. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the generous support of GIZ as our sponsor for this session. Now I'd like to quickly go over the agenda. So we'll first to start things off, we'll have Jay Dummert with the USAID Africa Bureau provide opening remarks. Then we'll provide, following Jay's remarks, we'll give more information about GROWS, such as goals, objectives, activities, and key findings. And we'll also share an overview of our scorecard framework that will identify how to apply those findings for improved cross-sector programming. Finally, we'll have about approximately 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the session for 3 breakout groups. And during that time, I will highlight the different topics for each breakout group that you will select. And just a minor housekeeping rule. So during the session, we're having it on Zoom here, but if you could please enter your comments or questions in the chat function on the Pathable page that you had for the session login, we'd appreciate it. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the opening remarks. Jay is a water and sanitation advisor with the USAID Bureau for Africa, who has been in the role since 2019. Prior to joining USAID, he worked in Cambodia as water aids, learning, and effectiveness manager, where he supported country and regional programs with technical assistance, research, and M&E. And then prior to that, Jay worked with the World Bank's Water and Sanitation Program on the Scaling Up Rural Water Sanitation Project. So I'll hand it over to you, Jay.
Thanks, Marc. I'm really happy to be here. All right, so USAID recognizes the role of good governance as a critical component to better and more sustainable development. Improved sector governance and finances is a development result in USAID's Water and Development Plan and underlies success of the other 3 development results, which are focused on sanitation and hygiene, safe drinking water, and water resource management. In the case of water, improved governance means that all people have access to high quality water services that are citizen-centered and delivered transparently and equitably. This is, in turn, has ripple effects across all other USAID development priorities. So better water governance also contributes to increased trust in a government's ability to manage and be accountable for critical and highly visible basic services and resources citizens need every time they need them, and that they know who to turn to if there are issues. So GROWS is funded by USAID's Bureau of Africa, as previously mentioned, under our broad agency announcement mechanism. This mechanism is designed to acquire research and spur innovative approaches to meet our development objectives. For GROWS, a co-creation process was used where USAID worked closely with GETF and the team to brainstorm and design the activity. Since the source of funding for this effort was the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance account, DRG account, we are most interested in how to better incorporate DRG concerns in other development areas, such as health, economic growth, and of course, WASH. The concept around GROWS fits that goal really well, and the analysis and tools generated will be very useful to us and especially to our field missions. We're excited about the progress that this program has made, despite some delays initially from a USG furlough, and then of course, due to COVID. However, we are really grateful for the efforts and expertise of GETF and the team. And so on behalf of USAID, we look forward to today's presentation and discussion. So thank you very much for the opportunity to give opening remarks. Marc, back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jay, for those opening remarks and good highlights of USAID's interest in this important work. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Katie Sill. Katie is the Deputy Director for GROWS and the Program Director for the WaterPoint Data Exchange. Prior to her current role, Katie was a Water and Sanitation Advisor with USAID in the Water Office. She is an environmental engineer by training and has worked in both domestic and international water sectors. Over to you, Katie.
All right. Thanks, Marc. And great introductory remarks by Jay. You know, it's widely accepted, especially in the WASH sector, that inadequate water system governance contributes greatly to the challenges of the rural water sector. The community management model, which has been championed as a solution for rural water services, frequently places an unmanageable burden on communities that do not have the technical, financial, or management capacity to ensure system sustainability. In many sub-Saharan African nations, policymakers have looked towards the private sector to assist with the delivery of rural water services. However, in some cases, a lack of accountability and transparency mechanisms within rural communities and inadequate oversight from appropriate authorities can discourage the nascent private sector from engaging in rural water service provision. Recent findings provide optimism that improving services in the rural water sector may be possible through the private sector if both all actors are held accountable for their roles. So the GROWS objectives were to explore the connections between governance and rural water services with a local level focus. So we started with a focus on accountability with an objective to identify and disseminate innovative governance models and tools to improve accountability of private operators for sustainable rural water services. And this was really a focus here on this local level governance loop that's shown, you know, this loop exists within a much larger and more complex set of relationships, including line ministries, regulators, financial institutions, donors, and NGOs. But GROWS was focused on the actors that are most critical for governance at the local level. So at the top, you see local government authorities. This is villages or ward leadership, district or county leaders and engineers, and others who are responsible for local level implementation. On the lower left, you see community members and any associated representative committees for water users. And then service providers. Now, this includes a broad array of potential providers, including the private sector, but also providers such as NGOs, faith-based organizations, and other entities that are delivering water in the rural space. And each of these actors is connected through two-way connection around accountability and other services. And as we dug further into GROWS and did some of the initial desk and field work, we found that the objective needed to evolve to be slightly broader. So next slide, Mark. And here, the objective went beyond accountability to look at other kind of a more broad look at private sector tools and approaches that can help improve multiple aspects of governance. So this is now identify and disseminate innovative private sector tools and approaches to improve the governance of rural water services. Next slide. GROWS was guided by two specific research questions, which again were broadened from accountability to a more broad look at the different aspects of governance to try and determine how rural communities and local government authorities can contribute to improved governance and encourage the engagement of the private sector and hold the private sector accountable, or water service providers accountable. The second question was, how can private sector providers contribute to improved governance and hold rural communities and local governments accountable for reliable payments and stable markets? To help answer these questions, our research partners at Ohio State University and Global Partners for Development conducted a combination of desk and field research. The field research was focused in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and data collection efforts included key informant discussions, focus group interviews, and remote surveys with government, private operators, and water users. Ultimately, our team will be developing a toolkit and resources that will strengthen linkages between the water and DRG sectors for improved outcomes. Next slide. Briefly, I want to touch on the governance framework that GROWS used for looking at the governance lens. We looked at four main components, including transparency, accountability, trust, and equity. We defined transparency as the public availability of information related to financial, political, and managerial transactions related for water system. For accountability, we looked at structures and behaviors that ensure providers and users uphold their responsibilities. Trust, focus on the confidence that providers will act in the best interest of their users, maintain a reliable service, and secure technologies. And equity is inclusion in the water system across gender, ethnic, and economic lines. Amy and Beck will go into more detail regarding findings for each of these four aspects of governance. All right, back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Katie. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Giannotti, who is a senior research associate with the Global Water Institute at Ohio State University. She's a hydrologist by training and has worked as an environmental engineer in both the private and not-for-profit sectors. In her current role, she helps to develop programs and research projects that support local priorities by forming partnerships between communities, researchers, local government, NGOs, and the private sector. So I'll hand over to you, Rebecca, for the presentation of the findings.
Thank you so much. And first up, I just want to recognize that I'm representing the work done by the whole Ohio State team, including 2 faculty members and 2 graduate students, as well as our in-country research collaborators. So as Katie mentioned, we combined multiple data sources for this work. We did an extensive review of work that is published and publicly available, including journals, programs, evaluations, and government documents and policy. We also collected a lot of primary data in the 3 countries. We had interviews with a range of different stakeholders, and then 6 in-depth case studies, 2 in each country. The case studies were chosen to cover as many different tools and approaches to rural water service provision as possible. Some are locations where services are currently active, and in some cases, the services had been running, but for different reasons aren't active anymore. And those failed examples provide good learning opportunities as well. In each of the case study locations, we conducted key informant interviews with people close to the projects, local government officials, village leadership, and the water service providers or managers. And we also held focus group discussions, both with local leadership and users of the water service. Next slide, please. So from this work, we identified 24 different elements of private sector water service provision at the local level that influence those 4 pillars of governance in different ways. These span the length of the water supply chain, from water sourcing through to monitoring and communications, And our 6 case studies included 16 out of these 24 elements. So I'm going to speak to results where the case studies cover those 16. And then for the other 8 elements, the results have come from our secondary data sources. This table illustrates those 24 factors. I'm not going to read this out in full, but you can see a range of different types of frameworks, management structures, technologies, different types of tools and practices or processes that private sector providers use. This isn't an exhaustive list, and the way that these elements are organized in this table isn't definitive in terms of categorization, and some are in more than one box. But I hope this gives a sense for how these 24 elements we looked at are spread across the water supply chain at the local level. Next slide. So when we put together what we heard directly from the interviews and focus groups and the secondary data sources, we tried to tease out both the influence that each of those 24 elements individually had on accountability, transparency, trust, and equity, and then also look across all the elements to find commonalities. So what was it about a particular structure or tool that achieved a certain outcome? And was there another type of element that could achieve the same result? From that analysis, we found 10 factors that were shown to improve those 4 components of local governance when they were present in rural water service provision. So the first 5 factors were access to technical and administrative support for service providers, access to financing for those providers, particularly when they were trying to operate in areas without economies of scale, having regular maintenance checks and repairs by a qualified and trained technician, formal documentation of ownership, roles, responsibilities, and service standards, and then well-defined, agreed upon, and well-known tariffs. Now, I recognize that some of these are not surprising to some people here, and you've probably seen them at play in your own work. But I think it's interesting and worth noting that we saw a variety of different ways that you can achieve the same outcomes in different settings. So as an example, I've got down there legal registration and formal contracting, subscription maintenance operations, contingent funding, funding pools, franchising, umbrella organizations, and microfinancing structures can all help with setting and publicizing performance standards and tariffs and putting formal documentation requirements in place. Next slide. The other 5 factors were community involvement in every part of the process, from planning to decision-making and oversight, equitable access to water for all members of a community, regardless of their ability to pay, incentives to provide water to marginalized groups, having an effective process for recourse and consequences if people didn't live up to their obligations, and making sure that accurate information about water system, technical and financial performance was not only accessible to all users, but understandable and usable for them. And again, we found there wasn't one specific way to achieve these outcomes. So for example, providing information about system performance came through community meetings and participatory planning, and also through things like electronic taps and smart meters, publicly available audits, dashboards, remote monitoring, and sometimes also through umbrella organizations. Next slide. So now I just want to talk a little bit about what we heard specific to each of the 4 governance pillars. Firstly, with transparency, this was critical across all the contexts, unsurprisingly, and types of water service provision we studied. We heard directly from people in the case studies that better transparency increases a user's willingness to trust the provider and willingness to pay. In terms of how transparency is achieved, that depended more on the type of provider than the context. Many communities preferred in-person meetings and face-to-face contact, but technology could be useful because it allowed multiple stakeholders access to the same information and more greater volume and accuracy of information. But that comes with the caveat that tech has to be accessible and understandable by all the users, or it doesn't carry benefit. And there were several frameworks that helped improve transparency as well, like funding pools and franchising. Next one, accountability. This was also essential to building trust. A couple of approaches that were effective to improve accountability were increasing a community sense of ownership and involvement with the water system, use of smart meter technology, which gave users confidence that the provider couldn't rot the system and also kept users accountable for their payments, and sanctions, which were sometimes used by providers against communities and they were highly effective in reducing fraud and misuse. And formal structures, again, like franchising and contingent funding, also helped with accountability. None of the 4 parts of governance operate in isolation, obviously. So smart meters not only helped with accountability, but also transparency. And sanctions also seem to increase trust because cheating wasn't tolerated. Next slide. So speaking of trust, this came up in absolutely every single conversation. And we think it's arguably the most critical part because, and in all the relationships between users, providers, and government, but it's obviously really hard because it's both a precursor for and a result of the other elements of governance. We heard significant issues around the ability of users to trust the provider or a tap attendant, as the case might be. They felt it hard to trust a person they felt was dishonest, couldn't account for transactions, or if there were questions about how tariffs are set and being charged. If users have one bad experience, it can sour their opinions for future providers and lead them to be unwilling to pay for a service or seek out alternate water sources. Things we found to help improve trust besides transparency were having a demonstrated record of good performance, responding quickly and appropriately when there were problems, and being really engaged with users in a meaningful way. The more involved the users were, for example, through inclusive decision-making, the more they trusted the system. And it was not only an issue between users and providers, but also between the provider and the government. The businesses needed to be able to trust government regarding the respect and maintenance of operating agreements. Next slide. And finally, looking at equity. In our interviews and focus groups, we heard repeatedly that people want to ensure there's equity both in who receives a water service as well as who's involved in decision-making, management, and oversight. So equitable representation and participation. With regard to women's engagement, we've frequently heard about ensuring women are included on water boards and committees, but we also heard about that not being sufficient, that sometimes women don't speak up or their opinions aren't valued. So women's engagement needs to go beyond meeting a sort of gender quota. There needs to be incentives or mechanisms for providing services to communities that aren't attractive to providers, perhaps certain marginalized groups or very remote locations where it's hard to turn a profit. And we heard from user communities how important it is to make sure their most vulnerable members get clean water, even if they can't access it very well or afford to pay. And often they have a way to do that internally, like with social costing or collective payments. And I want to add a couple of additional notes about gender here. We were told without any prompting by male heads of household that better water access meant reduced household disputes. And in one case, we were directly told by the head of household that it reduced violence at home. And one interesting viewpoint we heard directly from the women was that, of course, they do value having clean and accessible water. They don't argue that there are reduced domestic disputes, but they also noted that they value the time that they spent collecting water because it was socialization time, and it also provided time away from the house and household-based work. We weren't able to dig into that any further, but I think it's really an interesting perspective to keep in mind in terms of how women place value on their time. Next slide. So the last thing I'd like to cover is some of the contextual factors we found really influence local governance. This isn't necessarily a list of problems, just factors that were very influential. A couple relate directly to the service provider. If they can achieve economies of scale, if clustering would help, are they a member of the community or an outsider? What kind of organization or business structure are they? The physical environment really matters, and particularly if there are other sources of water available besides the one being offered by the provider. Familiarity with technology was really important. In some places, tools like smart taps, information dashboards, smartphone apps are really effective. But in other places, people either don't have access to those tools or they're not very familiar with them, so they don't use them very much, and other methods will be more effective. And the development of the private sector itself was really influential. Is there an existing private enterprise experience around the water sector, or is it very much a public good mentality? And coordination within the water sector, within the country, can be really beneficial. Not dissimilar in many ways to coordination between implementers or donors. My last slide here, many of these factors are political. What is the relationship between the private sector and government? We found that people in government who have experienced themselves working in the private sector and not have been civil servants for their whole career, we're more likely to support privatization of water services and help to build that sector. The strength of oversight bodies, obviously very important. Is enforcement something that only exists on paper, or does it have real teeth? What is the wider political environment like? Is there widespread patronage, clientelism, politicians making campaign promises about access and pricing and so on? And one thing we found really detrimental was political takeover of water services. Sometimes when a provider got really successful, they were taken over and co-opted by the government, which is obviously really demotivating and disincentivizes professionalization of water services. And I'm just going to finish here with one final thought, which is about household decision-making. We heard from communities that obviously they have multiple uses for water and needs, and sometimes it's hard for them to be tied to rigid rules about water they can use and for what purpose. They might know that the water they pay for is meant to be for drinking or domestic consumption only, but what if they want to use it for household irrigation, or they can't afford to buy enough from that service for irrigation? Where do they get the rest of their water needs from? If they have to seek out alternate water sources for agriculture anyway, what's their incentive to keep paying for a specific domestic service? I don't think any of us have answers to these questions, but as water specialists, we need to keep them in mind about how water is intertwined with other community and household needs and priorities. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Beck, and to the entire Ohio State team for really good field work and desktop research and presentation of those findings. So now I'd like to introduce Amy Holter, who will share a second presentation of fieldwork findings. Amy is the monitoring and evaluation consultant for the Global Partners for Development, specializing in WASH-related monitoring and evaluation. She has worked in programs and evaluation with a focus on WASH in East Africa for over 8 years. So I hand it over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Mark. So Ohio State University, as you've heard, did very broad research on this topic across East Africa. And Global Partners for Development sort of zoomed in on one area of Tanzania to do some statistical analysis that I will talk about now. So Global Partners for Development oversaw a quantitative analysis of governance indicators at water systems in 27 rural villages in Singida, Tanzania. The analysis uses survey data that was gathered in May 2019, December 2020, and June 2021 through targeted key informant and water user interviews. Analyses include a before and after evaluation, as well as a cross-sectional evaluation at endline. Next slide, please. The study was also meant to include qualitative focus groups. However, these were canceled due to COVID-19. Instead, we are currently using a service called Viamo to text surveys to users and key informants at water schemes in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The results of these surveys are forthcoming. Next slide. Oh, not yet, sorry. GPSD also initially planned to conduct a quasi-experimental evaluation to measure the impact of new private operators at half of the water sites in the study. So we were meant to have a control group. However, in the time period between the baseline and endline surveys, the Tanzanian government passed new legislation and implemented a new governance mechanism that did not include private operators. Now, next slide, thank you. The new legislation established a federal agency called the Rural Water and Sanitation Agency, otherwise known as RUWASA. The new emphasis on management by RUWASA, through that new emphasis, private ownership of water systems was no longer politically supported, and the intended evaluation of systems run by private operators was no longer possible. In response, the research pivoted to evaluate the impact of this shift from local oversight alone to enhanced federal supervision. The law put into place many requirements for how newly formed water committees called community-based water supply organizations, or CBWSOs, which is a difficult acronym, govern water systems. For example, all CBWSOs submit monthly and quarterly reports to RUWASA. All maintenance issues must be reported to RUWASA for evaluation and repair. All CBWSOs are required to have a joint bank account with RWASA, and RWASA is also responsible for providing a full-time accountant and technician for every CBWSO. Salaries for these staff are intended to come from revenue from water sales, but these did not exist at any of the sites that we surveyed. Next slide, please. We surveyed more than 1,600 water users, 53 village leaders, and 24 water committee members at Nline. Women and men were equally represented in the water user surveys, but women made up a very small percentage of village and water committee leadership. Next slide, please. While the lack of a control group may prevent the ability for us to identify causality in this research, there were clear correlational patterns that will contribute to the body of research on water system governance overall. I'll now share some examples of our results. There was disagreement between water providers and users on the number of system operational days, with users reporting fewer operational days, but there was agreement that when operational systems broke down, it took the operators fewer days to resolve the problem at Nline. There were mixed results in user satisfaction and trust at Nline. Overall, there was an increase from baseline to Nline in the percentage of users who felt that their concerns were consistently addressed. The percentage of users who thought that their payments for water were used appropriately increased significantly, but the number of users who believed that the system would be functional in a year and that service providers cared about them fell significantly at Nline. These mixed results may be due to differences in the extent to which various sites had functional CBWSOs and the extent to which local and federal government entities had found effective ways of working together. While service providers reported requesting feedback more often at Nline, the amount of feedback provided fell. There is the potential that the transition from previous water committees, which were integrated into the village system, to CBWSOs may have led to fewer meetings and fewer opportunities for dialogue with users at Nline. The number of women who provided feedback fell at Nline at a similar rate to that of the general population. Women and people with self-reported disabilities generally provided feedback at a similar rate to the rest of the population, though more women provided feedback to the village government than to the CBWSOs. Next slide, please. Being the head of household, being younger, having a disability, and being wealthier corresponded with reporting more positively to questions on system governance and user participation. The existence of any form of mass communication from village government in the last 6 months had sweeping impacts on user satisfaction. This could include public meetings, which were the most common, text or WhatsApp messages, paper notices, etc. For example, receiving messages in the last 6 months correlated with users providing more feedback and believing that the water price was reasonable, that their feedback was used, that their concerns were addressed by service providers, and that water technology was secure and reliable. Another key finding was that service providers requesting feedback had mixed results on governance indicators. For example, CBWSOs requesting feedback correlated with users paying more often, providing more feedback, believing water technology was secure and reliable, and believing the water quality was high. However, it also resulted in a negative correlation with user belief that feedback was used, that concerns were addressed by service providers, that the cost of water was fair, and that service providers cared about them. The above may suggest that requesting feedback is not enough to inspire trust, but that feedback must be used and that actions must be taken on the feedback in a public way for positive governance outcomes to be realized. Additionally, feedback being anonymous had a similarly negative correlation to user belief that concerns were addressed and that service providers cared about them. This may suggest that feedback provides more satisfaction to users when it can be done in person or with the user's name attached. This may also be due to the fact that when feedback is given anonymously, there is less opportunity for service providers to respond, and therefore more potential for users to be unaware of how the feedback will be used. This research highlighted that two-way communication is key. Predictably, system functionality had a very strong correlation with user satisfaction. though there was a surprisingly positive correlation between longer length of time spent repairing a system and user willingness to pay for water. This could be due to a link in improved understanding of the complexity of the system and additional opportunities for learning about how much money must be collected to support maintenance over time. This evaluation details many instances of improvement and decline in governance indicators from baseline to endline. Any transition to a new system, especially one with as broad a scope as that of RWASA's oversight, will take some time to settle, and additional research is needed to determine its successes and continued challenges. We'll talk a bit more about that in the breakout groups and the possibility of engaging more with organizations around gathering additional governance data. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy, for the presentation. Now, I'd like to close by handing it over to Bryan Ensline, who will be talking about how we are forming these findings and insights into applications for improved collaboration between the governance and water sectors. Bryan is a civil engineer with over 10 years experience in the international development sector. And he provides technical support for multiple GTF programs and is a principal and co-founder of the Global Build Collaborative, a small business A&E firm specializing in supporting international small-scale engineering activities. And prior to that work, he was worked for USAID. So I'll hand over to Bryan now.
Thanks, Marc. So to jump right in, as you could tell from discussions with Katie, Rebecca, and Amy, we've been able to compile multiple surveys, case studies, and comprehensive literature review to better understand water governance. Our next goal was to take these detailed documents and lessons learned and put them into a series of products that would be useful for USAID democracy and governance officers. Next slide, Marc. So based on the research takeaways and with contributions from a former USAID DG officer, we came up with multiple products and goals of first, informing a DG officer of our findings, and two, increasing a DG officer's ability to become involved in cross-sectoral work and collaborate with water sector experts. So, go back real quick, Marc, sorry. So our products include compiled findings. So it's kind of an introduction of the GROWS overview. We have technical background documents that include overviews of rural water technologies, rural water management schemes. We have a WASH at USAID overview for those outside the sector. We also have country-specific summaries that allow officers to better understand specific governance challenges of our focus countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. We provide tools to assist in data-driven product design that includes the WPDX platform discussed by Dr. Katie Sill earlier. We also would provide groups with annexes of the OSU landscape, research findings, the GPFD's impact reports, and also snapshot survey summary reports. So we have all these tools, and our goal was then to figure out how do we actually make something useful for officers in the field, for USAID officers in the field. We understand that a DG officer isn't going to spend all their time reading hundreds of pages about rural water governance. And so we came up with, we're trying to figure out some way to connect the dots on these. Our desire in creating a toolkit was to allow users to quickly access specific information that would allow them to engage in products and provide impacts without having to wade through the entire report and survey documents. Next slide, Marc. And so we interviewed multiple DG officers in the field, and we heard about several options that they had, or several toolkits that they've used in the past that actually allowed them kind of to better use, to better work with their colleagues outside of the DG sector. One was a health evaluation scorecard that was built to allow officers to assess public health services at a local level. These scorecards allowed officers to rapidly evaluate field conditions and engage with health officers in program evaluations and project planning. We decided to take our findings around our report and surveys and turn them into something similar, a pathway for DG officers to engage with WASH activities. As you know, there are multiple scorecards or field evaluations across the WASH sector. IRC has the WASH system building block assessment tool. UN Habitat has multiple WASH needs assessments. However, our goal wasn't to look at the entire water system, but just elements that we saw contributed to the system's governance, and to do so through the PETA, the participation, inclusion, transparency, and accountability lens that DG officers are familiar with. The scorecard scores a project or a project plan across these four PETA elements. Next slide, Mark. And so to connect the dots, we designed the scorecard to be used to complement our tools and guide users around what can be improved and what potential solutions can help with this improvement. The goal of the survey isn't to provide a definitive grade or pass-fail assessment of a water system, but an overall look at how the system is aligning with a strong PETA approach. Functionally, a user would use the scorecard on either a site visit or during a project planning process to assess strengths across the PETA principles. Where gaps or low scores are found, users can use our toolkit tools to find reinforcing methods and technologies to strengthen the project. For example, if a project has a low transparency score, a user would look up technologies or governance management schemes that have been shown improvements in transparency. If desired, they can continue to read detailed research in our surveys to result in better understanding of these potential solutions and their impact. In short, the scorecard can be used as an entry document to what part of our toolkit would be most useful for the user. So I'm not going to go through the details of the scorecard questions now. Perhaps we can get into that a bit more in the breakout rooms, but in brief, we selected 3 to 7 questions for each PETA area that represented the key findings of our research. The user scores each question and compiles an overall score for that area. Again, this score is obviously subjective and meant as an indicator that an area can potentially be improved through the use of our research findings. So we can go through this in a bit more detail, like I said, in group 1 and breakout group 1 if you're interested. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to Marc.
Great, thanks, Bryan. And I think due to time, we can focus any kind of questions you might have initially from the findings into the breakout groups. So highlighting, so if you can see at the bottom of the screen on the Pathable session page, 3 different breakout groups. So you can select one of those 3 breakout groups. Group 1 will be diving into kind of key barriers and opportunities for collaboration in the water and governance sector. So it's kind of continuation of using the scorecard as a framework to help identify where some of those challenges and opportunities are. Group 2 will be looking at the linkages of good local governance and system sustainability. And Rebecca will be leading that discussion. So you can dive deeper into maybe also some of the more technical functionality questions related to the systems. And group 3 is going to be focusing on connecting local water governance to national and larger scales. So Amy and Katie will be leading that group discussion.
Hey, Marc, before we jump into the groups, there's one question from the chat about our research findings available in any publications, research briefs, or similar documents that are publicly available. Just wanted to see if you want to go over that real quick.
Sure, yeah, sorry. And we are currently still finalizing. We have field work that's ongoing right now that we're wrapping up in Kenya and Tanzania. And then our timeline and our goal to be synthesizing and putting the findings into final toolkits and products is scheduled for the springtime of 2022, so around February, March timeframe. We are planning on having some publications in journals that abstracts are being submitted to that right now. But if you are interested in learning more about the findings once they are ready to be disseminated, please enter your contact details into the chat function, and we'll add you to the list for when those the findings are available. And or if you're interested in sharing more about what your group is doing, we'd love to continue this conversation outside of this lunch session. So with that, if you could, please enter, and thank you everyone for the presentation. Look forward to continuing this discussion in the breakout groups, and please select one of the breakout groups in Pathable. And thank you everyone.
Just a note, if anyone is having an issue, we're going to post it in the chat as well, but participants may need to add the breakout rooms to their agenda. One of the breakout rooms seems to be having an issue with that, but we're trying to get that resolved. So for anyone who may have not caught that, we are now transitioning to breakout groups, which you can find at the bottom of the Path Bolt page. So once again, if you're just joining and are looking where to go, please look at the bottom of the page for the breakout room actual rooms, so you can join those as we transition to that part.